Welcome back. I'm your host, Valary Smart, here on What Do You Think? Thank you for joining us. I have my guest again with me here on the show. Well, actually, he's via Skype. Okay, so Edward Escobar, he is the CEO and founder of the Alliance for Independent Workers and the gigsup.org. Basically, he is fighting for the rights of drivers, and he has a voice, and we have a voice, but we're not using it like we should. So, Edward, how are you today?
Yes, thank you, Valerie, for having me. And the Alliance for Independent Workers, well, we're not doing too well.
Okay.
We are as far as making headway and getting progress, getting things done, and getting traction. But the drivers are not doing well, and that's why we're
So
here
that
and
means
we're
you're not
discussing this
doing well
matter.
because you're still a driver, correct? Or are you not driving?
Yes,
You are. Okay. And we're
yes,
talking
I
specifically
still
about
am.
Uber and Lyft, right? Uber and Lyft drivers?
Well, we're addressing the driver condition across the board for the driver's lifestyle, the driver's, being driven into poverty and suicide. And this is happening not just to any app-based drivers, but also to the taxi drivers, the limo, livery drivers, if you will. And this is across the country, and this is globally.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about and elaborate. Can you elaborate more on the condition? So let's talk about it from a health standpoint. What is it that you're seeing out there?
Well, we're seeing the amount of PTSD, and believe it or not, I mean, some people they think that that's related to wartime conditions and veterans coming back, but no, post-traumatic stress disorder. If you're exposed to an ongoing level of stress,
Mm-hmm.
it really does affect you, and it sticks with you. And so what that translates to for drivers is they're under the thumb of these app-based corporations like Uber and Lyft that are constantly putting pressure that they have to perform or face deactivation, and that can lead to immediate termination, like in the real world with other employment relationships. And there's no notice, there's no advance warning. It happens, and all your investment, everything you've done, you've purchased a car, you've leased a car, all of these things go to hell in a handbasket immediately.
Okay, well, I
So
will get to that, but I wanted to kind of focus on the health aspect of it. So, for instance, the hours that are driven by each driver
oh
and how
yeah,
that affects their health from, sitting in the same
right,
position for so long.
yes,
I've heard of drivers
that's correct,
developing gout, having muscle
right,
spasm, stiff necks. They're eating
yeah,
unhealthy because they cannot, take the time to go to a restaurant and
right,
sit down and eat properly. They are
yeah,
rush,
even
rush,
even
rush.
go to a
They're
restaurant.
always looking at their phones, trying to get the next best ride. And they don't know where they're going, right? So there's so many different avenues in regards to just being an Uber Lyft driver. And again, I wanted to talk with you more about it from a health standpoint, and then we can dive into the actual conditions
Yeah,
that drivers deal with on a daily basis. So, are we going to break right
okay,
now? Nope. Okay. So,
yeah.
all right. So, elaborate more on any conditions that you know of that drivers develop from being on the road for so many hours a day.
Well, what you've just said is a very valid point. Sedentary death syndrome, that's very real. It's SDS, it's the second leading cause of death. And, when you are sitting on your backside 11 hours or more on a regular basis, that's shaving days, weeks, months, years off of your life.
Hmm.
So that is very real. Sedentary death syndrome, look it up, Google it. You'll see that these people are being affected by that. There's a host of health implications of driving beyond the sedentary death syndrome, as if that weren't enough, right?
Right. Right.
Being in a vehicle, that new car smell, that'll kill you
Is that
because
so?
that's
I
the
didn't know that.
off-gassing of
What about the
petroleum-based
new car smell?
products.
What about it?
What's that?
What about the
The
new
new
car
car
smell?
smell it's an off-basing of petroleum-based products. And so when a person's sitting in the vehicle for that long, and a lot of these folks, they've got vehicles that are either brand new or relatively new, and this off-gassing is in the car, and they're sitting in there, they're sleeping in there, so it is very detrimental.
And that's another
beyond
aspect,
that,
Edward, the sleeping in the car.
right.
How many,
Well,
what's the percentage of drivers that you know of that do this for a living and sleep in their car? Do you have any
I'll
idea
tell
on
you
that?
that drivers are the new class of homeless. For example, San Francisco, they're filling like Safeway parking lots, different locations and neighborhoods, and they're sleeping in their vehicles. So they're driving to hit their bonuses. They're staying away from their family. Some of them they're driving in from all different parts of the state to drive in San Francisco because geographically, the way it's set up, it appears to be a little more lucrative than the other areas.
Right.
But
right.
what you're experiencing is basically the new class of homeless, and you can't get restful sleep in your car. It's impossible. So what's happening is these folks are driving on these apps for extended periods of time, many hours,
and we're
they're
talking
only
like
sleeping
maybe
an hour
over
here,
12
an hour
hours,
there.
over 12 hours a day?
Oh yes,
Okay.
easily.
Okay.
Easily, yes. Yeah, because they have nothing else to do because they're away from their home. So they figure they're going to hit these bonuses and they're going to continue to rack up as much as they can for the time they're away from home.
And where
Now,
are they
we've heard
bathing? Where are they cleaning themselves up at and staying, sanitarily clean?
That's a good question. Some of them, they have gym memberships. Some of them, they go into restaurants or service station bathrooms. Even at the airport lots where the staging is happening for picking up customers, they basically have the construction type site portable toilets there, and washing facilities. Sometimes they don't have soap. Sometimes they're out of water. So you can imagine these folks just use the restroom, and then they're going and they're handling people's luggage. They're perhaps touching the people.
Yeah.
So it's very unsanitary. But the point is that the way that the drivers are being treated at the airport staging lots is worse than animals being treated at the county fair.
In what way?
For instance.
And so go ahead and explain that a bit further.
Well, I mean, if you look at the different weather conditions throughout the country, you go from extreme heat to extreme cold, and that really impacts these areas for the drivers because they don't have shelter, they don't have air conditioning. They have to pretty much get everything from their car.
Okay, and so being at the airport, the conditions are bad at the airport because they're using porta potties.
Right, porta potties that are not even up. The upkeep is poor, and then the washing facilities there for your hands sometimes are not available, and they're not maintained. The upkeep on it is just not there because it's such a high usage.
Okay,
so
well,
you can imagine
people,
all
Edward,
this is very unsanitary. On top of that, you have the exposure that these drivers have from passengers that are flying from different parts of the country, different parts of the world, transporting viruses, all types of diseases you can imagine.
Oh, no, I was going to
making
bring that up
contact with
to
the
you
vehicle.
because, from my own experience, okay, I remember picking up a few passengers. I had one get right into the passenger seat next to me, and he was coughing, and you can hear all this phlegm, and he was sniffling, and I turned to him, and I said, hey, are you sick? Do you have a cold? And he says, oh, no, it's my allergies. And I'm like, okay, because it didn't sound like allergies to me. Well, guess what? The very next day, I was on my ass, just totally sick. And this was around
Yeah.
New Year's Eve a few years ago. I was done. And I contracted my illness from him. So do you think that drivers have they're more susceptible to getting sick because of dealing with so many people that don't really care if they pass on the germs to you or not, because they don't see you as equal anyways. They look at you as less than.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
They're on the front lines in terms of making contact with these folks that are transporting these potential harmful viruses,
Right.
From all parts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then if you're handling their luggage, on top of that, a person who rubs their nose and then they touch their luggage, and then, you touch their luggage. So it's a transfer.
Okay.
But going out of the airport arena, because that's pretty bad. I mean, it's bad. In many areas in Las Vegas, it gets extreme hot and extreme cold there. In other parts of the Midwest and New York, it's just basically a parking lot with these construction site type porta potties.
Okay.
How can you really expect someone to be out there just running their car and relying solely on their vehicle? So
they're going to say, people say to the drivers, hey, you don't have to do this. You don't have to drive. Go do something else if you don't like the conditions of the job and what it requires.
Would they say that to the coal miners? Would they say that to the other displaced workers? Would they say that to, let me give you an extreme example, a woman who suffered sexual assault and rape at a job from her boss?
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that to her? You wouldn't say that to her.
No,
so why
not
would
at all.
you say that to these other folks that are human beings?
Right.
Why? Because they're looked at as being subhuman,
Mm-hmm.
and these are immigrants, low income, minorities, seniors, disabled, single moms, veterans, even folks that have been more marginalized, that have had a criminal record and they've already been rehabilitated. They deserve a second chance.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't get that second chance, they could revert back to crime,
Right.
which costs more to maintain them in a jail or prison than to do the right thing by
And the
themselves. Give them a second
recidivism,
chance.
the recidivism rate is higher if they don't
Exactly.
have something to occupy
Exactly.
their time in a way for them to financially take care of themselves and their family. I wanted to switch
That's
gears
correct.
and ask you, what are the current rates right now? So what are drivers getting? For instance, what is the surging? How is all of that changed? So what are the current rates for drivers right now?
Well,
And we can just talk maybe
is,
from San Francisco point.
And bottom line, it's not what people think it is. And in many cases, if you don't drive intelligently, in a smart way, a person who has experience,
Mm-hmm.
You could be looking at less than minimum wage. What you hear in the news sometimes about these folks the drivers making decent money, this is not the norm. This is occasionally, when it rains, it pours, you'll get something there, but it's not what the norm is. And so we have to look at the average, the median average of what drivers are out there making, and it's less than minimum wage. It's less than minimum wage. And as an independent contractor, if you're a real independent contractor, which we're not, we're misclassified, we're mislabeled as independent contractors, we're being treated less than part-time employees.
Okay.
A real independent contractor would first of all be able to negotiate their own rates. And that is entirely possible because there was an app at one time called Sidecar that enabled drivers to negotiate with the riders. And that way it was a win-win situation.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone was happy with the outcome.
Okay.
That app is no longer. But to put it in the perspective, for a real independent contractor, they need to be making minimum 2-3 times easily what a minimum wage employee would be making.
Okay, but
because
what is
you have
minimum
the overhead,
wage?
you have the operating costs.
What is minimum wage currently? So we can put it all in perspective for the listeners and viewers.
I mean, since this is on a national level, this Fight for 15 national push, they have a graduated increase that they're offering workers across the country. So in some places it could be $10, $11, $12,
Mm-hmm.
$14.
Mm-hmm.
Some have hit 15 already.
Okay.
So the truth is that by the time everyone hits 15, we should already be doing 20.
Okay.
It's always behind the curve. So a lot of workers are suffering. And just recently, with this government shutdown, where do you think a lot of these folks dumped, their worries and woes on financial onto the gig economy, which the drivers are a large part of the gig economy and growing. So
Okay.
what they've done, the workers from the government shutdown, there's a lot of Coast Guard folks, a lot of different workers. They said, hey, we're going to go and drive for Uber or Lyft until we're able to get back on with our jobs. And what that did to the full-timers, the folks that are really reliant on the service to earn a living, they were devastated significantly because the market's already tight. The bottom line, it's oversaturated. Uber and Lyft and these other app-based companies continue to recruit ad nauseum. It's excessive, it's extreme. The recruitment, and they target the soft targets, the voiceless majority folks that you spoke of earlier. The immigrants, the low income, the minorities, the whole laundry list that I mentioned.
Okay,
Because
so
they're easier to use and abuse and kick to the curb. And that's a serious problem, and no one has been speaking up for them other than ourselves that we've been doing nationally and internationally, bringing that voice and telling the stories and getting the driver's narrative heard. You've heard a lot of stories about riders, assaults on riders and everything. Well, you can imagine how many more riders there are than drivers. Now, let's flip the script when it comes to assaults. More drivers are getting assaulted by riders on a regular basis than the other way around. But yet you don't hear about it as much for the drivers. You're hearing more of these other sensational stories, like the female pregnant woman who was stabbed to death with, that was horrendous by a rider. But those are like the extreme cases that you may hear those stories. There was another person who had his throat slit. Another a driver who was a witness to a homicide, and now his life is being threatened. So
okay. So
these are
as we're gonna have to go to break right now, Edward, and we'll come back and elaborate and have you elaborate more on that. But I did also want to talk about the income that drivers are receiving. And you had mentioned it's less than minimum wage, but I really want to break that down. So I want to take that and dive into that a little bit more. So we'll be right back with What Do You Think? I'm your host, Valary Smart, with my special guest, Edward Escobar. We'll be right back.